Lázaro Mondragón was, in his essence, a man built of dust and sun, a mason whose calloused hands knew the language of cement and brick better than that of words. At 45, his path was a straight and honest line, marked by the sweat that ran down his forehead under the merciless sun of northern Mexico. He was a builder of other people's dreams, erecting luxurious fortresses for men whose lives were distant from his reality, while his own fortress was modest, made of love and routine. I know that many of you listening now know men like Lázaro. Perhaps you are one of them. If this story touches you in any way, I ask you to please subscribe to the channel so I can continue to bring reports like this one. Comment where you're speaking from. I want to know how far the voice of a common man can reach. Our goal is to hit 1,000 subscribers, and every one of you makes a difference. His life, however, was not defined by the walls he built, but by the two souls who waited for him at home. Elena, his wife, was the mortar that held his existence together. Her smile was the foundation of his peace. And Sophia, his 15-year-old daughter, was the masterpiece of his life, a young woman full of dreams who blossomed amidst the aridness of Ciudad Perdida. For Lázaro, happiness was not in the palaces he built, but in the sound of Sophia's laughter echoing through their small house, in the smell of Elena's stew at the end of an exhausting day. He worked under the scorching sun, feeling his muscles protest, just so he could return to his little paradise, a refuge he believed to be impenetrable, protected by the love he felt for them. They lived in a neighborhood where silence was often broken by the distant sound of sirens and where the shadows seemed to have owners. Ciudad Perdida was a chessboard disputed by armed ghosts, and Lázaro knew it. He taught Sophia to walk with her head down, not to look strangers in the eye, and to avoid the dark streets after nightfall. He was a man who believed in discretion as a shield, in routine as a trench. His philosophy was simple: work hard, take care of your own, and don't get involved where you're not wanted. He saw the cartel's luxury cars pass by, the halcones posted on the corners, and he would feel a chill. But he would quickly push it away, focusing on the image of his family, an amulet against the evil that permeated the city's air. The night everything changed began like any other, with the promise of normality. Lázaro had come home with a small cake to celebrate Sophia's grades at school. The scene was a portrait of the purest and simplest happiness. Elena humming softly in the kitchen, the smell of cilantro in the air, and Sophia showing her father her report card with a pride that made him feel like the richest man in the world. They sat at the table, and for a brief moment, the outside world, with its brutality and corruption, ceased to exist. In that instant, within those four walls, he had plastered himself. Lázaro was a king in his castle, a guardian of a priceless treasure, completely oblivious to the storm gathering outside, about to break down his door. Lázaro's internal conflict was silent, an ember that burned beneath the surface of his apparent calm. As he built walls for the rich, he felt the weight of irony. Those thick, imposing walls guaranteed a security he could never provide for his own family. He didn't covet their wealth, but the peace it bought. He felt a dull impotence, the awareness that, despite all his effort, his family lived in a vulnerable house, in a city where life was cheap. This frustration, however, was quickly converted into more work, into more hours under the sun, in the naive hope that his dedication and honesty would somehow be armor enough against the cruelty of fate. That week, the tension in the city had become palpable. There was a new order in the neighborhood, a new owner of the turf, and the Los Cuervos cartel made sure to mark its territory with exemplary violence. Lázaro noticed the harder stares, the strange men circling in trucks without license plates. One day, returning from work, he saw a neighbor being dragged from his house by masked men, while the police drove by on the other side of the street, pretending not to see. He quickened his pace, his heart hammering in his chest, and when he got home, he hugged Elena and Sophia with a force that startled them. He said nothing, but in his silence, he prayed that this wave of darkness would not reach his door. The last moment of peace was tinged with a dark premonition. While Sophia slept and Elena finished washing the dishes, Lázaro sat on the porch, looking out at the silent street. The air was heavy, still. The streetlights flickered intermittently, like tired eyes standing watch. He felt a knot in his stomach, a sense that something was terribly wrong, like the silence that precedes an earthquake. It was the intuition of an animal sensing a predator. Nearby, a feeling that made him get up and lock the door a second time. He looked out the window, but saw only the familiar darkness, not knowing that the monster was already there, hidden within it, hungry and cruel. His identity as a builder was about to be undone, brick by brick. The man who found purpose in erecting, in creating order from the chaos of sand and water, was on the edge of an abyss where his only function would be to destroy. The hands that had cradled his newborn daughter, that had caressed his wife's hair, that had built a life of dignity, would soon become instruments of a vengeance as methodical and cold as the concrete he used to mix. In that instant, Lázaro Mondragón, the mason, the husband, the father, was still breathing. But the sudden, violent sound of his door being kicked in marked the exact moment he began to die, and something far more terrible began to be born in his place. The sound of splintering wood was the thunder that announced the end of Lázaro's world. 3 masked figures, moving with the brutal efficiency of wolves, stormed the house. The celebratory cake fell to the floor, crushed under a dirty boot. Lázaro, frozen for a split second, reacted with the primal instinct of a father and husband, moving to place himself between the intruders and his family. But he was a mason, not a warrior. His hands, made for building, were useless against the barrel of a gun that struck him across the face, throwing him against the wall. The impact left him stunned, the taste of blood filling his mouth as he watched, helpless, as Elena and Sophia were grabbed, their screams of terror tearing through the silence of the night and Lázaro's soul forever. The leader of the intruders, a burly man whose brutality was visible even through his mask, grabbed Elena by the hair. His voice was a low, glacial growl, devoid of any emotion. He spoke directly to Lázaro, who was slumped against the wall, dizzy and bleeding. "This is a message for everyone. In the neighborhood," the man said, "this turf has a new owner. Nobody sees anything, nobody hears anything. You understand?" The reason was so banal, so disproportionate to the atrocity unfolding, that Lázaro's mind couldn't process it. His family, his entire universe was being sacrificed as a mere example on the altar of greed and power by men he didn't even know. They weren't targets, they were just a tool. What happened next was a blur of indescribable horror, a sequence of images that would be burned into his memory, haunting him in every waking moment. He saw the fear in Elena's eyes turn to defiance, a final act of protection for her daughter. He heard Sophia's desperate cry, a sound that became the soundtrack to his personal hell. The burly man, whom Lázaro would later learn was known as El Martillo, gave a signal to his men. 2 dry, muffled shots echoed through the small room. Lázaro saw the bodies of his wife and daughter fall to the floor, lifeless, like rag dolls. The world around him lost its sound, its focus, its color. All that remained was a deafening ringing and an absolute void. Motionless, in shock, Lázaro just stared at the scene, his brain refusing to accept reality. The pain had not yet arrived, only a cold disbelief that paralyzed every muscle in his body. El Martillo approached him, the barrel of his gun still smoking. He looked down at Lázaro, broken and destroyed, and let out a short, cruel laugh. "So you remember the lesson," he said, before raising his weapon and striking Lázaro's head with crushing force. The last image Lázaro saw before being swallowed by darkness was not of his attacker, but of Sophia's hand, outstretched on the floor, just inches from his own, a touch he would never reach again. He was left to die in the mausoleum of his own home. When consciousness returned, it was not all at once, but in painful fragments. The smell of clotted blood, the stiffness of his limbs, the deathly silence that filled the house. The pain in his head was excruciating, but nothing compared to the abyss that had opened in his chest upon seeing the scene exactly as he had left it. The police had already come and gone, leaving only yellow tape and a filed-away report. In that desecrated silence, Lázaro dragged himself to his family's bodies. There, beside them, he understood that justice would not come. The law was dead in this city. In that moment, the mason died, and the executioner began to breathe. I understood then that, if I wanted justice, I would have to build it with my own hands. I ask you to subscribe and share this story, as it is the only way to ensure that the voices of the forgotten like me are not silenced by corruption. The days that followed were a blur of physical pain, and a grief so profound it seemed to have weight and form. Lázaro barely remembers how he left that house, now a tomb, or how he ended up in a dingy boarding-house room on the other side of the city. His body, a map of bruises and cuts, screamed for rest, but his mind wouldn't allow it. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of Elena and Sophia, not as they were in life, but in their final moment, frozen in horror. The pain didn't break him. It calcified him. It turned his sorrow into a substance as hard and cold as steel. He understood that mourning would be a luxury he could no longer afford. Pain would only be fuel. On a cold night, he returned to what was left of his old workplace, a large construction site, silent under the moonlight. There, in a metal container, were his tools. He picked them up, one by one, their familiar weight now feeling different, more sinister. The sledgehammer, which once broke concrete, now had a different purpose. The pickaxe used to dig foundations would dig graves. The mason's trowel, sharpened at the edge, became a blade. This was his new baptism. He was no longer Lázaro Mondragón, the builder. That night, under the indifferent gaze of the stars, he shed his name and his humanity, embracing the new and terrible identity that fate had forced upon him. His first step was not one of violence, but of observation. For years he had been invisible to the powerful men of the city, just another worker dirty with cement. Now he would use this invisibility as a cloak. He knew the shortcuts, the alleyways, the skeletons of abandoned buildings where the cartel's business flourished. He spent weeks listening, watching from the shadows, mapping the routines of the low-level members of the Los Cuervos cartel. He learned their schedules, their vices, their fears. His knowledge of the city, once used to find the shortest route to work, was now a weapon to chart the shortest path to his targets. The first execution was clumsy, ugly, and brutally personal. The target was a young Halcon, a cartel lookout whom Lázaro had overheard bragging in a cantina about being present on the night of the massacre. He cornered him in a dark alley. There were no catchphrases, just a raw confrontation. The young man was fast, but Lázaro was driven by a fury that gave him superhuman strength. The fight was short and savage, ending with the dull thud of a sledgehammer. After it was over, Lázaro vomited, his body shaking uncontrollably. Killing was not natural for him. It was a violation of everything he had ever been. But as he looked at the fallen man, he saw the smiling face of El Martillo, and knew he would do it again. Guilt assaulted him that night, an overwhelming wave of self-loathing. He saw himself in the cracked mirror of the boarding-house room, another man's blood on his hands, and wondered if Elena and Sophia would recognize the monster he was becoming. The image of his daughter, her pure smile, almost made him give up. But then, as a cruel counterpoint, the memory of the gunshots of her final scream echoed in his mind. The pain was an anchor, mooring him to this path. He realized that innocence had died in that house along with his family. What remained was merely an instrument of vengeance, and that instrument needed to be sharpened, not broken by guilt. It was in that moment, at the lowest point of my existence, that I made a promise to myself. There would be no more hesitation. Every life I took would be a step on the ladder to reach the top, to the man who ordered the destruction of mine. I know many may judge me, but I ask you to try to understand what happens when the system abandons you. Your subscription to this channel helps give a voice to this reality, to show that stories like mine are not just about monsters, but about how they are made. With each new member, I feel that I am not completely alone in this darkness. Over time, his methods became refined. He became a shadow, a ghost that moved through the city. The second and third kills were cleaner, more efficient. He used the environment to his advantage, turning construction sites into death traps. One sicario was found at the bottom of an elevator shaft, another impaled on steel rebar. He left no traces except for a symbolic signature, a single brick carefully placed on the chest of each victim. It was the mark of the Mason, a grim reminder of who he was and what they had destroyed. The city began to whisper about a new kind of predator on the streets. The press, hungry for sensationalism, christened the mysterious killer El Verdugo, the executioner. Leading this coverage was Ana Castillo, a young investigative journalist full of idealism and courage. At first, she saw El Verdugo as just another symptom of the disease consuming the city, another brutal murderer in an endless war. Her initial reports painted him as a monster, a danger to public order, without understanding that the order was already rotten to its core, and that he was, in fact, the fever of a sick social body. Anna, however, was not the type to be content with the surface. She began to investigate the lives of El Verdugo's victims and noticed a clear pattern. All were known, albeit unprosecuted, members of the Los Cuervos cartel. Her curiosity led her to unearth cold cases, police reports that ended in dead ends. That was how she found a small file on the brutal murder of the Mondragón family, a case closed for lack of evidence in record time. The connection began to form in her mind, transforming the story of a monster into the tragedy of a man. Within the cartel, tranquility gave way to paranoia. The leader, Ricardo Morales, El Patron, initially dismissed the deaths, considering them low-level disputes, but when one of his trusted lieutenants turned up dead, contempt turned to fury. He tasked his chief of security, the sadistic and feared El Martillo, with hunting down this ghost that was haunting his business. The irony was cruel. The monster's creator was now in charge of destroying him, unaware that the creature he was hunting was the same victim he had left for dead months before. In the halls of the corrupt local police force, the case of El Verdugo was a hot potato. Captain Ramirez, a man on El Patron's payroll, demanded results, pressured by the cartel. But for Sergeant Diaz, a cynical veteran tired of seeing justice sold, the murders were a form of macabre poetry. Arriving at the scene of the cartel lieutenant's death, he discreetly kicked a bullet casing under a dumpster, a small piece of evidence that could complicate the gang war narrative. He wasn't helping El Verdugo, he told himself. He was just refusing to help Los Cuervos. The execution of the lieutenant was Lazaro's masterpiece so far. He lured him to the top floor of a skyscraper under construction, a place Lázaro knew like the back of his hand. The chase was a cat-and-mouse game in the shadows and labyrinths of concrete and steel. Lázaro used his knowledge of the structure to isolate the man, making him get lost in an environment that for the Mason was a home. The final confrontation was not a fight, but a slaughter. Lázaro cornered him on a balcony with no railing, and with a single powerful push sealed his fate. The lieutenant's death was a turning point. Ana Castillo's article, published the next day, was explosive. She not only linked the victim to the cartel, but also published the names of El Verdugo's other victims, alongside the cases of murder and extortion the police had ignored. For the first time, she mentioned the Mondragón family, suggesting that the executioner was not a psychopath, but a victim. Seeking a justice the state had denied him. Public perception began to shift. El Verdugo was becoming a legend, a folk hero to the oppressed. As his legend grew, the man behind it disintegrated. Lázaro lived in a state of constant alert, fueled by cheap coffee and the hatred that consumed him. Sleep was an enemy, bringing nightmares populated by the eyes of his victims and the screams of his family. He began to talk to Eleanor and Sophia, whispering to their faded photographs, promising them he wouldn't stop until the last person responsible paid. His sanity was fraying, replaced by a cold, singular obsession that was the only thing keeping him on his feet. It was in this ghostly state that he was found by Father Miguel, the priest from his old parish. The old priest approached him on a dark street, his eyes full of sadness and compassion. "Lázaro, my son, look at what you have become," he said softly. "Vengeance is a poison that consumes the soul. Stop before there's nothing left of the good man you once were." Lázaro just stared at him, his face an expressionless mask. "You don't understand, Father," he replied, his voice hoarse. "God doesn't live in this city anymore. He left that night. Now, only the devil and I walk these streets." That confrontation with the priest marked an internal turning point for me. Rejecting salvation, the last bridge to my old life, was the confirmation that there was no turning back for me. The Mason's soul was buried. What remained was only the executioner. It's a lonely journey, and sharing this with you, feeling that someone understands, even from a distance, is what keeps me from losing myself completely in the darkness. If you believe that sometimes the only possible justice is the one we forge ourselves, subscribe so that more people can hear. Sergeant Diaz, feeling the pressure mount, decided to act more boldly. He anonymously left a box of old files at the door of Ana Castillo's office. Inside were details about Los Cuervos' money laundering operations, many of them linked to major construction projects. And, at the bottom of the box, a copy of Elena and Sophia's autopsy report, a document that had never been officially released and which contained details only the killer and the police could have known. Enraged by the humiliation, El Martillo brutally intensified his hunt. He and his men descended on Lázaro's old neighborhood, terrorizing his former neighbors for any information about the man he believed to be dead. They beat innocent people, invaded homes, showing that the cartel's cruelty had no limits. The news reached Lázaro, filling him with a protective rage. They weren't just hunting him, they were desecrating the memory of his community, the last sacred thing he had left. Lázaro could not allow it. In an act that marked his total transformation from victim to predator, he hunted the hunters. He followed the group of El Martillo's sicarios that was terrorizing the neighborhood. One night, as they prepared to invade another house, he eliminated them one by one with a silent, lethal efficiency he hadn't possessed at the beginning. He used the shadows, the layout of the streets he knew by heart, turning the environment into his weapon. He didn't kill them for revenge, but to protect the innocent. It was the first time his violence had a purpose beyond himself. Ana's article, fueled by Diaz's files, was her masterpiece. She exposed the network of corruption between Los Cuervos and Captain Ramirez, detailing the construction sites that served as fronts for the cartel. And powerfully, she published the details from the Mondragón autopsy, questioning why the police had ignored such clear evidence. The city erupted. The narrative of El Verdugo as an avenging angel solidified, turning him into a dangerous symbol of rebellion against a failed system. The fear Lázaro had sown began to bear fruit. A mid-level cartel member, terrified of being the next target of either El Verdugo or El Martillo's internal purge, sought out one of Ana Castillo's contacts. He offered a valuable piece of information in exchange for a chance to disappear. The location of an abandoned warehouse where El Martillo met with his closest men. The information reached Lázaro through an enigmatic note left at a prearranged spot by Ana, who now saw herself as a reluctant participant in one man's war. The information was the missing piece. Now he had a clear target. El Martillo, the man who pulled the trigger, the source of all his nightmares. Lázaro spent the following days in preparation, not just tactical, but ritualistic. He returned to the ruins of his house one last time, walking through the haunted rooms, touching the stained walls. He didn't go there to feel pain, but to absorb it, to forge it into the final armor for the battle to come. He was saying goodbye to the last ghost of Lázaro, the mason. The reflection in the mirror did not lie. The eyes staring back at him were cold, devoid of any light but the fire of hell. The lines on his face were deeper, carved by grief and rage. His mason's hands, once creative, were now undeniably those of a destroyer. He no longer felt the distinction between justice and vengeance. The two had merged into a single overwhelming need. He had become the monster necessary to hunt the monsters of the world, and he accepted the price his soul would have to pay for it. With his tools sharpened and his plan laid out, he went out into the night. There was no hesitation in his steps, only the steady purpose of a man with nothing left to lose. The hunt for El Verdugo was about to end because El Verdugo was now the hunter. He moved through the dark streets of Ciudad Perdida, not as a fleeing ghost, but as the very personification of death, marching inexorably toward the heart of the darkness that had consumed his life, ready to confront the man who was the hammer that had broken him. The abandoned warehouse was a carcass of metal and concrete, an industrial skeleton on the forgotten outskirts of the city. Lázaro moved through the shadows as if he were born in them, each step silent and deliberate. The air was heavy with the smell of mold, oil, and the cheap electricity of tension. Inside, under the yellow light of hanging bulbs, he heard the guttural voices and cruel laughter of El Martillo's men. He didn't enter through the front door. Using his knowledge of structures, he found a rusted support beam and climbed to a broken window high above, descending inside like a spider on its thread. He was not a soldier storming a fortress. He was a predator, infiltrating a nest of vipers, his heart beating a cold, steady rhythm. He revealed himself not with a shout, but with the metallic scrape of his sledgehammer on the concrete floor. The conversation stopped. The men turned, and in the center of them stood El Martillo, larger and more brutal than in his memories. For a moment, the Sicario chief didn't recognize the bloodied, emaciated figure staring at him. But then his eyes locked on Lázaro's face, and a slow, sadistic smile spread across his features. "Well, look what we have here," he snarled. "The mason came back from the dead. Did you come to finish the job?" Lázaro didn't answer with words. His eyes, two embers of pure hatred, and the way he raised the sledgehammer were the only reply needed. The promise of unimaginable violence hung in the air. The fight that followed was a storm of contained fury. El Martillo's men advanced, but they fell quickly under Lázaro's precise and desperate rage, as he turned his tools into extensions of his arms. Soon, only the two of them remained. It was a duel of monsters. El Martillo with the brute strength of an animal, and Lázaro with the tireless endurance of a man who had already lost everything. They clashed amidst piles of debris, their blows echoing through the vast warehouse. Every punch Lázaro took was fueled by the image of his family. Every swing of the sledgehammer was a syllable of his wife's and daughter's names. It was the personification of pain against the personification of cruelty. Lázaro, wounded and gasping, finally found an opening. He shattered El Martillo's knee with a sideways blow from his tool, sending the giant crashing down with a roar of pain. Overpowered, the great killer was at his mercy. "Why?" Lázaro panted, the tip of his pickaxe against the man's throat. "Why my family?" El Martillo spat blood and laughed. A gurgling, horrible sound. "For nothing," he sneered. "We were celebrating. We needed some fun. Your house was just there. That was all. You were nothing." The banality of that evil, the complete absence of reason, was the final blow. It extinguished the last spark of humanity in Lázaro. With a cry that was more animal than human, he brought his tool down, fulfilling the promise he had made to himself. As El Martillo drew his last breath, a phone rang in his pocket. Lázaro picked it up. It was a message from El Patron. "The party has started. Bring the wine and make sure no one disturbs us. Captain Ramirez is already here." The party. While his life was being destroyed, they were celebrating. While he fought a mortal battle, they were toasting. In that instant, his revenge on El Martillo felt incomplete, merely a prelude. The true evil was not the guard dog, but the master who held the leash. Exhausted, bleeding from several wounds, Lázaro made his decision. It would not end here. He would go to the party. He would become the uninvited guest who brought hell as a gift. Ricardo Morales's hacienda was an island of opulence in a sea of misery. Loud music, bright lights, and the laughter of the corrupt and powerful filled the air. Lázaro arrived not through the main entrance, but over the back walls, a shadow of death moving through the perfectly manicured garden. He didn't hide. He walked directly into the party's courtyard, covered in blood and dust, the blood-stained sledgehammer in his hand. The first to see him was a sicario, whose smile froze on his face, then a scream, followed by another. The music stopped. Panic spread like a virus as the guests ran in terror from the ghostly figure who advanced, an angel of death in the midst of their profane paradise. He found El Patron in his office, desperately trying to call for a help that would not come. Ricardo Morales was not a warrior like El Martillo. He was a middle-aged man with soft hands and a face pale with fear. The untouchable cartel leader, the god of this city, now trembled before the mason he had destroyed. "Who are you?" Morales stammered. Lázaro stepped forward into the light, and Morales's face twisted in terrified recognition. "I am Elena's husband, Sophia's father," Lázaro said, his voice an echo from the grave. "I am the man who built the walls of this city, and now I have come to tear it all down." He raised the sledgehammer one last time, the reflection of the terrified man in his eyes mirroring the monster he had finally become. There was no prolonged confrontation in El Patron's office. The final brutality was swift, almost surgical, devoid of any emotion. Contrary to what he had imagined in his sleepless nights, Lázaro felt no overwhelming triumph, no cathartic relief of vengeance fulfilled. As he watched the life drain from the man who had ordered the destruction of his world, he felt only a deep, cold silence settle into his soul. The last name on his list had been crossed off. The final brick of his revenge had been laid, but the structure he had built was an empty mausoleum. He had annihilated the architect of his pain, only to find that the pain was now part of his own foundation, inseparable from who he was. Standing amidst the blood-stained luxury, with the sound of sirens approaching like a funeral dirge, Lázaro looked at his own hands. A mason's hands, which once knew the joy of creating something from dust, were now only instruments of deconstruction. He had become the dark mirror of the men he hunted, an expert in turning homes into tombs. Vengeance did not heal him. It did not bring back the smell of Elena's cooking, nor the sound of Sophia's laughter. It merely emptied him completely, leaving him alone at the summit of a mountain of corpses, with a cold that no sun would ever warm again. The journey was over, and he was more lost than when he had begun. Before the first squad car arrived, he vanished, not like a fugitive, running from the law, but like a ghost dissolving into the pre-dawn mist. He blended into the shadows of Ciudad Perdida, the city that was both his canvas and his punishment. He walked the streets like a memory, invisible to the waking world. He was now an urban legend, a horror story whispered by criminals, and a tale of hope for the desperate. Lázaro Mondragón, the mason, was dead and buried. El Verdugo, the executioner, no longer needed to exist. What was left was just a shell, a man condemned to wander forever with the ghosts of his family and of the lives he took. The collapse of the Los Cuervos cartel left a power vacuum, but it also brought a brief, fragile period of peace to the neighborhoods they had terrorized. Ana Castillo wrote the full story, not as the chronicle of a murderer, but as the autopsy of a failed system that turns victims into monsters. Sergeant Diaz filed the case of the Hacienda massacre as an internal settling of scores, his final act of silent rebellion. The city moved on, as it always does, absorbing the violence into its troubled history. And on the walls of alleys, graffiti began to appear, a sledgehammer and a brick, the symbol of an avenging angel who, for a moment, made the scales of justice tip toward the forgotten. My revenge is complete, but the truth is, I did not win. There is no victory in becoming the thing you despise most. Today I walk, a ghost among the living, and my only mission is to tell this story so that perhaps others will not have to walk the same path. I thank every one of you who subscribed and listened to the end. Your support is proof that the memory of Elena and Sophia has not faded completely, that my pain served a purpose beyond destroying me. Keep sharing, so that the voices of the silenced may echo louder than the sound of gunshots. As for me, justice did not bring me peace. It only left me with silence, and the certainty that some walls once torn down can never be rebuilt.